from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are most pleased to welcome to our program today Senator Dirk Kempthorne, a Republican from the state of Idaho. Senator Kempthorne was first elected to the United States Senate in 1992, and prior to that time he served 2 terms as mayor of Boise, Idaho, elected first in 1985 and re-elected in 1989. Since he went to the United States Senate, our guest serves on the Armed Services Committee, as well as the Environment and Public Works, and also the Small Business Development. While Senator Kempthorne has been in the United States Senate, one of the things he has become best known for is his work on dealing with federally mandated requirements and programs and relating that to funding. Senator Kempthorne, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our program, and we look forward to this time to talk about the session of 1994, the kinds of domestic legislation that went through or did not go through, and also some foreign policy issues. We're just so happy to have you with us today.
Tony, thank you. I look forward to this also.
And I would say to our viewers who are in the other 6 states, in addition to Idaho, that I'm sure you'll find the Senator's comments interesting because these issues are very relevant to all the United States and even to other countries. I'm also pleased to welcome our regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and Janelle shall commence our questioning.
Great.
Senator Kempthorne, welcome to North Idaho College and to the program. We'd like to learn a little bit more about your background, because I know that your background ties in directly with some of the committees that you serve on in Congress. So before we talk about the 1994 congressional session, let's talk a little bit about your background.
All right. Well, Janelle, I graduated from the University of Idaho up here in North Idaho. And then before becoming and running for mayor, I was in the private sector. I worked for FMC Corporation, and then prior to that I worked for the Department of Lands and for the Home Builders Association. Then I ran for the office of mayor because I really believe in local government. And some people said that if you have any sort of political ambitions, don't run for mayor, because local government is, it's 24 hours a day, and it can be kind of rough and tumble. But my thought was, if that's the extent of my public service, so be it. I love that community. I wanted to make some contributions to it, working with other people. Following that, I ran for the U.S. Senate, and actually the day that I took the oath of office in the United States Senate, I resigned as mayor. So we interrupted that mayor's service by just a few months.
And you do serve on 3 very important committees. Can you give us just an idea what each one of those committees, the charge is to each one of those committees?
Sure. The Armed Services Committee, as you know, would deal with all aspects of the military service of the United States and our national defense. The Environment Public Works Committee deals with a number of the environmental issues. Again, my perspective as a mayor, things such as the Safe Drinking Water Act, why I can bring that perspective. We'll be dealing with the Endangered Species Act, and for a natural resource-based state like Idaho, that's very important. And then the Small Business Committee. Small business is really the backbone of a lot of our economy here in the state of Idaho, so I'm real pleased with that assignment as well.
Steve Schenck.
Senator, one of the things we wanted to do today was to take a look at key issues and legislation. And I want to focus on a few of those. Before I do that, though, I thought I'd give you an opportunity to just sort of cover the waterfront and talk in general terms about the things that you see either immediately past or upcoming that are of real significance.
Well, I would, one of the things I guess I would mention is Tony mentioned at the outset, the efforts to stop these unfunded federal mandates. They're nothing but hidden federal taxes. It's estimated, Price Waterhouse did a study of cities all across the United States, that about 12 to 15% of the funds of local budgets goes immediately to these unfunded federal mandates. And it has direct impact. It can mean whether or not a school district gets new textbooks or increases teachers' salaries. It can mean whether or not you have a new police officer or fireman at the local level. The states are also being hit by this. So the first bill that I introduced was to stop unfunded federal mandates. We now have 67 sponsors in the Senate. John Glenn has joined me as my partner in this. We have a majority of sponsors in the House of Representatives. The bill has passed the Senate Committee, Government Affairs Committee now with a unanimous vote. It's passed the House 35-4 in that committee, and it's bipartisan. It has the endorsement of the nation's mayors, governors, county commissioners, school board administrators, and it really is going to fundamentally change how the government works and allow Congress to no longer function in this vacuum, that it can talk about some project but have no idea the cost because they never have to pay for it.
Is there a rollback provision in that legislation, or would it affect only bills that pass in the future? It
is only from that point forward. It will not go retroactive. That really would be very difficult to accomplish.
And one other quick last follow-up question
Sure.
on that point. And I'm trying to oversimplify this problem, but from your view, is the problem of unfunded federal mandates a conscious decision on the part of the legislature that they're going to shift cost, or are they somewhat unaware of the effect that it has down the line?
Steve, I think it's just been a bad habit, to the point that they now, when a bill comes forward, they don't ask enough questions. My legislation says there will be a Congressional Budget Office analysis. It will identify how much that mandate costs, and it will identify the funding source. And if it doesn't have those elements, then when it gets to the floor of the Senate, you can raise a point of order and it's dead right there. That's how we should be proceeding. But also, there are some members of Congress that love this current process because, again, you can make political points by saying, here's something we need to have, we must have it, it's passed and enacted, and again, then it's the mayors and county commissioners, the school boards that have to pay for it at their expense, but that politician got the credit for it. That's not the good way to operate.
Senator, I should tell our viewers that we take this program on October the 24th, and some things may happen before it airs. And also, I know you're going back into session, I believe in December, to deal with GATT, for example. But one of the major pieces of legislation that was enacted this year, after much discussion and debate, was the comprehensive or crime bill legislation. And I know in some research that I did, it's really, really complex, and it's also comprehensive, covering so many areas. And I'd appreciate if you would take our viewers through some of these areas, like the issue of the funding of dealing with violence against women, or the death penalty being expanded, and so it would just, I think, be helpful to the viewers.
Tony, I think all of us agree this nation needs to do something about crime. Every day, I think at times we're even shocked by some of the latest things we see happening in our streets and our neighborhoods. So we ought to do something. Here comes a crime bill that really was 6 years in the making. Now, I've only been there for 2 years, but this was 6 years in the making. And it went from a $10 billion project to 22 to 28 to 30 to 33. They just kept adding all these programs. And language in there. I think, I certainly subscribe to the fact that if somebody uses a gun in the commission of a crime, there ought to be a stiff penalty for that. Mandatory. If an adult sells cocaine to a kid, there ought to be a stiff penalty for that. There ought to be restitution for victims. Language dealing with those items and many more were in the original version, but when it got to the conference, all of those were stripped out. Now, we have gun control that's in there, and I am not a supporter of gun control because I don't think that works. Washington, D.C. is the murder capital of the world. It has one of the toughest gun control laws on the books right now, and yet it's not doing the trick. You need to have crime control. So we have a program that unfortunately I think got away from us as far as the budget. It's over budget, It took away some of the strong language that would deal with crime, and I voted against it, and I think it's just tragic how Congress ultimately dealt with that.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Well, one of the things also that has happened during the last session of the Congress was dealing with the health care reform. And so perhaps you could tell us just a little bit of background on what has happened with the health care reform, where it stands, and then what you think is the prognosis for the future.
Okay. Janelle, I believe we do need to have health care reform. But I don't believe that it should be a government-run program, and I don't believe that we should do a total overhaul of this system, because it is the best healthcare system in the world. It's interesting that a lot of heads of state of other countries, when they have a personal health problem, they come to the United States for treatment. While I disagree with the President's healthcare proposal, I give him credit for bringing the issue front and center, where it should be. We should be dealing with this. I thought you might find it interesting. This is the Clinton-Mitchell plan. It's over 1,400 pages. We received this on a Friday at 5 p.m., and the next Monday we were supposed to start debating this. And it is filled with new taxes. It is filled with new regulations, new federal entities that would be created. And this was just not the right approach. It ultimately was withdrawn by the sponsor, Senator Mitchell. I believe that what we can and should do is, based upon the 2 years of good, solid debate on this, is come forward with a reform package that would contain things such as removing pre-existing condition clauses, providing portability so that that insurance program is in your name. You take it with you from job to job so that there's not job lock. Antitrust reform so that hospitals in a region can go ahead and communicate with one another and find out if there are ways that they could avoid duplicating services and bring the cost down. Malpractice and tort reform, because of the extent that physicians today have to practice defensive medicine because the lawsuits are so prevalent. Incentives for rural states like Idaho and the surrounding states. 100% tax deductibility for small operators. It's the same sort of tax deduction we give to corporations, but we ought to give it to the small operators. So those things I think we could agree on. We ought to vote on it, implement it, and we will begin some meaningful reform.
So is it a difficult process, I guess, is my question, to get something like this to happen? It seems like it's fairly simple to state in its broad terms, but it's when you get into the nitty-gritty, is that where the breakdown occurs?
Yes, because
so often.
Sure. When you go through this 1,400 pages, you find, for example, that
something you like, but something you don't like.
Right. There was a section that said that if an employer provides incentives beyond what the federal government would determine you should provide, there'd be a $10,000 fine. Well, we raised that. You know, we said this is wrong, and Senator Mitchell, when we pointed that out, said, "I didn't mean for that to be in there," and so we had an amendment and voted 100-0 to remove it. You just can go step by step and find out that there are things in there that should not have been. So, again, let's not jeopardize the good system we have. Let's modify it. Let's bring about the reforms such as I discussed, but we don't need an overhaul that's filled with this sort of regulation and taxes.
Steve Shink.
Senator, I'd like to shift to some international questions. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'm sure you follow the hot spots around the world. Of that growing list of North Korea and Somalia and Haiti and others, Kuwait, Iraq most recently, what concerns you most?
What concerns me most, Steve, is the fact that because the Cold War is over, there is this supposition that we now will have peace all over the world. And yet, you named a healthy list of hot spots. In January, I visited a number of those hot spots. I went to Mogadishu and just saw the war zone that had developed in the name of humanitarian aid, where we simply wanted to go and feed starving people. But soon it evolved to the point that our troops had to hunker down. We lost 18 Rangers. I went to the area where in the Persian Gulf, where I saw the Saddam Hussein and has some of his activities that you have to stop. North Korea is another delicate situation. And I guess what I would say is, and I think we are going too far, too fast in cutting our defense budget. And historically, every time we have done this, we have gone too far, too fast. And I think we're on the same verge of doing it again.
Let me follow up on that just a little bit, and I should probably leave this to Tony because it's almost a constitutional question. But I think there was a lot of frustration over Somalia because it seemed like the U.S. presence there was ineffective. That maybe the problem was bigger than we could solve. But more to the point, I read with some interest about a great deal of bipartisan opposition to U.S. forces being sent to Haiti, which raises that constitutional question that I alluded to of whether or not the president should continue to have the power to commit troops without congressional approval. How do you feel about that?
I believe there's a definite role, and it's prescribed in the Constitution, of the president as commander-in-chief. Now, even with Desert Storm, and again, I was not there at the time for that, but the president had the authority, I believe constitutionally, to proceed, but it was appropriate, I think, to come to Congress for their approval. I think the same thing should have happened with Haiti. And because you see this mission creep that happens, and that's very difficult. I think you need to determine, is there strong national security interests? Is there a threat to the United States? I don't see that in Haiti. Also, for a moment, if we may just talk about Haiti, I think what is very interesting there is we saw our commander-in-chief the evening before an invasion really was to be launched, telling us in very straightforward terms how horrible that current leadership in Haiti was. But then, when former President Jimmy Carter went there, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell went, and Sam Nunn, the Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and reached a settlement, suddenly we changed our descriptive words about Cedrus and the others. But you had the world's only remaining superpower negotiating with Haiti, but we were negotiating with a former president and a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a situation where they were vulnerable. I think they showed a great deal of courage to be there because they could have become hostages. And then what sort of international crisis would we have with a former president being held hostage by a Haiti? I don't think that's the way we should be crafting foreign policy.
Senator, I have a follow-up question on that, and we want to move to the issue of GATT, because after our viewers see this program, I know you'll be back in Congress addressing it. But in the early 1970s, because of the conflicts in Vietnam, the Congress passed the War Powers Act, and doesn't that almost complicate this even more? In other words, in the Constitution, it's clear that Congress has the power to declare war, and then the President administers that as Commander-in-Chief. But through the War Powers Act, Congress has delegated to the President's action over a 60-day period. Do you think that needs to be revisited as a piece of legislation, or is that appropriate? I know that at the time it's passed, they were very cognizant of the fact that sometimes the President might have to move very quickly in the missile age in which we live.
Right.
Does it need any amendments, or does it serve us well?
Tony, I can't suggest for you right now that I think there's a compelling need that we need to change that. I do think we need to review it. I think that leadership often is to bring diverse groups together, and so if time permits, where a chief executive in his role as commander-in-chief can go to Congress and get that support, I think it benefits the whole nation. But there are other times that he may have to move quickly. And so again, I can't suggest for you right now that I have some sort of compelling amendment I'd offer to the War Powers Act.
The circumstances vary, don't they?
They do, they really do.
Another issue that we're hearing a lot about, and by the time this airs, certainly is GATT. And for our viewers, that's the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. What do you think is the future of that particular agreement as it comes before the Congress?
Tony, the fact that we did not deal with that during the regular session is indicative that the votes were not there to pass it. And so now we will come back November 30th, December 1st, and deal with that issue. That would be the only issue that we're to deal with. And I can't tell you what the outcome will be, because I don't think a lot of people have come to a final conclusion on that. I have sent a number of letters, hundreds of letters, to businesses throughout Idaho, asking them for their input. Because one of the things that really concerns me is the World Trade Organization, which is a concept that was tried before and has been rejected. But there are approximately 117 countries that would be part of this World Trade Organization. The United States would be one of those entities, but unlike the UN and the Security Council, we would not have veto power. If we don't like a ruling by the World Trade Organization, we're one of 117. We have to get the others to go along with us if we want to stop it. Also, there's something that I think is very important. That is, if there is a conclusion that there has been a trade violation of some commodity in the United States, the retribution can be aimed at a different commodity. So you may have something that in the agriculture, maybe somebody says that we have done wrong, but the retribution can be aimed at the microprocessing industry. So there are problems with it right now.
One thing you bring to my mind is someone who's been a student of the Congress for a long time and the presidency. There's a number of issues that are on the table, GATT and health care and welfare reform and all. They're major issues and they're very complex, and so part of this problem is what Janelle has already alluded to, and that is it is many details and very complex. I was looking at some of the highlights of GATT, and also domestically, in some states it appears to be very helpful, in other states it might not be, and so that affects the lineup in Congress too, does it not?
Well, it does, and as you know, originally the Senate was to be there on behalf of the states that they represent. And I do feel that that's a role that I'm to play, and that is, what impact does this have for the state of Idaho? And I think each senator, he or she needs to look at that with their own state that they represent.
I wish we had more time. We have a little more time for questions, but I'm going to follow up just one more time, and we have other questions to get to. But just briefly, how do you think this particular agreement would affect the state of Idaho? Would it be helpful? Or?
Well, Tony, we have shown that our business in foreign countries has really been increasing dramatically. In fact, Idaho has been doing some tremendous increase in business in Mexico, but that was being done before NAFTA and certainly before GATT. So trade is happening, and what concerns me is that sometimes people will equate this. They'll say, well, if you're not for NAFTA, then you must be against free trade. NAFTA is an 1,800-page document. There are some areas of concern in NAFTA. There are areas of concern with GATT. So we should be moving. We should be doing all that we can to bring about removing barriers, because we can outproduce any other country in the world if it's the level playing field. But we have to make sure we don't bring about a document that's going to come around and get us from the side.
Janelle Burke.
An area of continuing concern is the area of social services. Each year, I know the Congress deals with social services in a variety of ways, Social Security program and others. Specifically, though, I would like to ask you about the welfare program and what your feeling is about what's happened in the last session of the Congress, and then again, what you foresee for the future.
Janelle, I believe that we must have welfare reform. Congress needs to get serious about this. What happened last session? Not much. A lot of talk. We have, unfortunately, second and third generation citizens that are on welfare. And somehow we have to break that cycle. I'm not so sure that we can come up with the ultimate, best and final solution in Washington, D.C. I think we need to look again to the states for a lot of their wisdom. Pilot projects where they can be empowered to come up with some different approaches and determine what is working, what is not working. Even that which doesn't work, we're going to learn from. But when we talk about all these issues that Congress talks about, I think at the start of a session, it would be healthy and refreshing if we would just agree on 4 or 5 items, that's our priority for this session Let's resolve them. And one of them I'd put on the board as well for reform.
Some of these issues are so very broad, and there is so much interest in a particular state about how it's going to be carried out. What do you think about the Social Security program? What has happened with it, and what is going to happen in the future?
I think that's a contract that we make with our government. You have paid your funds in, you better be sure, and the government better assure that you get your funds back. Again, that's a contract. There are other areas that we need to be cognizant of, and in fact, I think that we can point to some areas where government is still expanding, still growing. We need to curtail that. We need to curtail, first of all, the attitude of many in the federal government that the government is the solution to everything. I still believe in individual initiative, that often that'll be the solution. I also believe in states' rights. And I think we're just usurping the 10th Amendment right, which in essence, Tony, says that those things not specifically delegated to the federal government are to be reserved to the states. And that's not happening. And I think you'll see states band together to reassert our 10th Amendment right.
Steve, we have about 2 minutes.
I'm going to follow up quickly on Janelle's question, at least in this respect. I want to ask you a little bit about your views of a balanced budget amendment, and I say it's related to Janelle because you can't really talk about balancing the budget without talking about defense spending and entitlements.
That's right.
Do we need it, and can we do it?
We need it, and we can do it. Really, it's been estimated that if you would just freeze the budget, just freeze it across the board, that in approximately 7 years, you'd at least have a balanced budget. Now, during that time, you can go ahead and determine what the priorities are and adjustments that should be made. But right now, we just need to start drawing a line. I was one of a bipartisan group of senators, about 15 of us, that proposed a $109 billion reduction over a 5-year period. If you were to look at the list, there'd be something on there that you'd tell me, boy, don't cut that. But you'd see that the whole list really was even-handed. Everybody would feel touched by it. And what I've been told by Idahoans is, we'll do our part if everybody else has to do theirs. And so it's going to have to be an even-handed, across-the-board approach, I think.
On that note, Senator, we have to bring the program to conclusion. I have the signal that we're out of time. On behalf of the panel and our staff, thank you so much for taking this time. You were very gracious with your time, and we appreciate it. We'd invite you to come back in the future and report to the citizens again on other actions that take place in the Congress of the United States.
Great. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Senator Dirk Kempthorne, Republican from the state of Idaho. We would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we shall discuss what we believe yet another important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.